Life and death are usually spoken of as opposites, as though one were a mistake and the other a punishment. We imagine life as something that arrives, stays for a while, and then is taken away. And so we cling, because anything that can be taken feels fragile. But this way of speaking already assumes too much. It assumes there is a solid thing here, a possession moving through time, traveling from beginning to end. Yet when you look carefully, life is not a thing at all. It is an event happening. And death, strangely enough, is not its enemy, but its boundary. We are taught, almost from the beginning, to think of ourselves as something that has a life, as though life were an object handed to us at birth, owned for a time, and then inevitably confiscated. This assumption hides quietly in our language. We say, my life, my body, my mind, as if there were an owner standing somewhere behind the experience, holding the title deeds. But if you pause and look for this owner, what do you actually find? You find sensations arising and fading, thoughts appearing uninvited, then dissolving, memories assembling themselves, not as solid records, but as living reconstructions. At no point do you encounter a permanent center issuing commands. There is activity, but no fixed operator. A dance, but no dancer separate from the movement. And yet we continue to speak as though there must be one. Because without such a center, the story becomes unsettling. If there is no enduring me, then what exactly is it that is born? And what is it that dies? So we create continuity by force. We stitch moments together with memory and expectation, persuading ourselves that the past is still here and that the future is already on its way. This stitching gives a sense of solidity, but it also gives rise to anxiety, because anything that must be held together can come apart. In this way, our fear of death is not really a fear of endings. It is a fear of losing control over a process we never truly possessed. Consider how easily we confuse continuity with permanence. A melody feels whole, yet no single note lasts. Remove the change, and the music disappears. Still, we insist on imagining ourselves as though we were a note that somehow survives the entire song. This confusion is reinforced by the way time is described. We picture it as a line, past behind us, future ahead, along which we are carried like passengers, and so we speak of going into tomorrow, leaving yesterday behind. But this image subtly suggests a traveler, something that moves through time unchanged while the scenery shifts. Look again, more closely. Yesterday does not exist anywhere for you to stand upon. Tomorrow has not yet appeared. There is only this moment, continually renewing itself, like a wave that seems to travel across the ocean while the water itself rises and falls in place. The body understands this better than the intellect. Every cell is replaced. Every breath is a letting go. You do not inhale once and keep the air forever. Breathing is possible only because release follows intake. Life continues not by holding on, but by constantly giving way. Yet the mind resists this rhythm. It wants guarantees, it wants assurance that something essential will be preserved. So it invents identities, roles, names, histories, and treats them as though they were substances rather than stories. We then attempt to defend these stories against change, which is rather like trying to preserve a whirlpool by grasping the water. This is why change feels threatening, not because it destroys us, but because it exposes the fact that there was never anything solid to defend. What we call myself is a pattern in motion, a temporary arrangement of forces, appearing stable only when we refuse to look too closely. The question is not how do I survive change, but what is it that is actually changing? Once we begin to sense that the self is a process rather than a possession, birth and death take on a different flavor. They lose some of their drama. They begin to look less like absolute events and more like punctuation marks in a sentence that is already in motion. Birth, then, is not the sudden arrival of something from nothing. It is the appearance of a particular pattern. This body, this nervous system, this point of view, emerging out of an arrangement that was already underway. Just as a wave does not come from the ocean, but as the ocean, so what is born is not separate from the conditions that give rise to it. Death follows the same logic, though we rarely allow ourselves to see it. We imagine it as a catastrophic interruption, a final erasure. But what actually disappears is not a thing. It is an arrangement. The pattern loosens. The boundaries we have drawn fade back into the field from which they were outlined. This is difficult to accept only if we insist that identity must be continuous to be meaningful. But notice how often meaning appears precisely through change. A word is understood because it begins and ends. A gesture matters because it does not last. Permanence would not preserve significance, it would cancel it. Seen this way, birth and death are movements within the same process. Points where form gathers and points where form releases. What we call life is not caught between them. It is the whole movement, happening, unbroken, and utterly unconcerned with our labels. The difficulty arises when we try to stand outside this movement and observe it as though it were happening to us. We imagine ourselves as spectators of life, rather than as expressions of it. From this position, every change feels like a threat, because the observer seems separate from what is observed. But there is no such distance. The sound you hear is not happening at the edge of awareness. It is awareness taking shape as sound. In the same way, the world is not something you encounter from a safe interior position. Your thoughts, your body, your surroundings, these are not three different realms. They are different textures of the same event. This misunderstanding gives rise to a subtle tension. We live as though we must supervise the flow, as though existence would collapse without our management. And so we rehearse the future, replay the past, and call this vigilance being responsible. Yet what we are really doing is mistrusting the process that produced us in the first place. Notice how exhausting this stance becomes. Control requires constant effort because it attempts the impossible to stabilize what is inherently fluid. It is like trying to keep a wave frozen at its crest, or demanding that a river pours midstream so we can decide where it should go next. When we relax this effort, the world does not fall apart. Breathing continues. The heart keeps its rhythm. Thought still appears when needed. Action still arises at the appropriate moment without being forced. This is not passivity or resignation. It is cooperation with a movement that was never opposed to you. What feels like surrender is simply the recognition that the dance does not require a separate dancer giving instructions. At this point, the question is no longer about whether change can be avoided, but about why we have been so determined to resist it. For what we are resisting is not chaos, but the loss of a particular image, an image of ourselves as fixed, knowable, and secure. We cling to names, roles, and stories because they give the comforting impression of continuity. They suggest that something essential can be carried forward intact. And so we speak of becoming someone, of arriving at a final version of ourselves, as though life were a project with a completion date. But notice how quickly these images age. The person you were certain you were 10 years ago already feels distant, almost fictional. And yet at the time, that identity felt unquestionable. What changed was not life, but the story you told about it. This is why attempts at self-improvement so often produce strain. They are built on the assumption that there is a deficient self that must be corrected and preserved in a better form. But improvement implies continuity, and continuity is precisely what cannot be secured. What actually happens again and again is replacement. Old patterns fall away, new ways of seeing appear, values reorganize themselves, and each time the mind scrambles to claim ownership, to say, this is still me, just upgraded. Yet this insistence misses something important. Growth does not happen by carrying the past forward. It happens by allowing it to dissolve. You are not becoming a better version of yourself. You are ceasing to be versions at all. When this is seen clearly, the pressure to define yourself relaxes. Life no longer feels like a performance that must remain consistent. It begins to feel more like a conversation, responsive, unfinished, and free to surprise itself. What we call renewal is usually imagined as an addition, something extra to be acquired, an insight to be kept, a state to be maintained. But anything that must be maintained already contains the seed of anxiety. For maintenance implies effort, vigilance, and the constant fear of loss. True renewal is simpler than that. It does not add, it subtracts. It is the quiet falling away of assumptions that were never questioned because they felt familiar. It is the release of identities that once seemed necessary for survival but are no longer required. And this release is not an achievement. It is more like waking up and realizing that the tension in your shoulders was unnecessary. This is why moments of clarity often arrive unexpectedly during grief, exhaustion, or sudden silence. When the mind is too tired to defend its positions, life continues anyway. And in that continuation, something reveals itself, that the process does not depend on our self-descriptions. Seen from here, continuity takes on a different meaning. It is not the persistence of a self, but the persistence of movement. Just as electricity flows through many bulbs without becoming any particular light, awareness appears through countless forms without needing to remain one of them.